Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 170. You're watching two guys, one in balmy Florida, one in the trenches of hysteria called snowy Connecticut. It's actually just turned into cold and flu season, I know, because I caught my first cold. I'm Kevin Carlson.
Yeah, and I'm George Conger, and I got a really bad burn yesterday. I was out gardening, and Kevin, I need the sunscreen to
SPF
protect my delicate
5000.
skin. Yes.
Okay, as I alluded to in the intro, I have a cold. You'll hear baritone. You'll see my brain flash on and off as we record this episode. We're recording this against my better judgment, but it's a good topic. George is well versed on it. He will do 99.9% of the topic, speaking to it because, well, that's what he's good at. And that should be the way for every episode, not just where I have the cold and flu. So we're going to talk about Cuba. A lot of people if you have short-term memory problems, don't remember in 1960s there was a revolution in Cuba. The socialist, well, communist, if you want to be more accurate, took over. Fidel Castro made sure all the businesses were government-run or and kicked out the churches and had a full-blown party for communism. People with short-term memory problems may not remember that we had a Cuban Missile Crisis when Russia started to put nuclear weapons into Cuba for 3 weeks. We had a blockade. We won the blockade. But in all this time, the Church of Cuba has suffered. It's largely Roman Catholic. There are some Episcopalians and Anglicans and other denominations. And for 50 years, we've closed down our relationship with Cuba through the democratic offices of the government saying we can't have any relationship with them. We're going to cut them off until they sink into the ocean. Now in 2015, Obama has called down to Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel, who was the leader of the revolution, and said, hey, we want to work with you guys. If you promise to let all the political prisoners go and open up economic relationships with us, we promise to start sending money your way and look towards a future together. Well, the Americans have kept their promises. However, they still have not released any political prisoners. Nothing on the Cuban side of the ocean has changed, except for a couple things, and that's news with the Episcopal Church. So I'm going to turn this over to George. George, the Diocese of Cuba has decided to join whom, but first tell us whom they had been with before.
The Diocese of Cuba began as a missionary diocese in the 1890s, around the time of the Spanish-American War. And in 1965, it had to break relations with the Episcopal Church of the USA because America introduced financial sanctions, and in the early 1960s, Fidel Castro began a purge of those who opposed the communist revolution. A number of the leaders of the Cuban church had to flee or were killed. Hugo Pena Lopez, who later became Bishop of Honduras and was my predecessor as rector of Church of the Redeemer in Avon Park, Florida, was a priest of the Cuban church who was tortured, beaten by the communist police thugs, and shipped to the U.S. as a political prisoner, to escape being a political prisoner. He started off in the U.S. loading trucks on the Burdines department store loading dock in Miami before he was allowed to become a priest in the Episcopal Church. Well, we have had 50 years, more or less, of broken relationships because of the political conflict. And in that time, we've seen two streams develop. One is sort of the radical chic within the Episcopal Church of just being enamored with Fidel Castro. You see this from time to time. There's a wonderful photo I've had that we use from time to time on Anglican Ink of Fidel Castro and Frank Griswold shaking hands. And you have to, those of a certain age will remember, and that's older than you and I, Kevin, of the just sort of rock star image Fidel Castro had at one time
Mhm.
among people like Frank Griswold, limousine liberals who looked at Fidel as being a cross between Desmond Tutu and, oh gosh, I don't know, name somebody else, Nelson Mandela.
I think you
It,
nailed it. Yes.
and it's the same sort of culture that we see when we see college kids put up posters of Che Guevara, who actually was a mass murderer, but we won't go down that path.
No, no, no.
So the Episcopal Church in Cuba survived, but it survived in a very broken way. It survived the way the Russian Orthodox Church did under Stalin and the communists.
Well, I think one of the
Its leadership
what
was compromised while it had a faithful remnant who were faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I think that's one of the problems with the Russian church is they had KGB in it.
Yes.
And certainly the Episcopal Church has been infiltrated by Fidel Castro's men, and
And not only in Cuba.
Jeez, that's right, up here in the great U.S. But one of the realities is after this long 50 years, how do we determine who are the faithful Christians and or the martyrs, and how do we honor their choices now? And that's one of those mishmashes we find ourselves in when we report this, is they have chosen now to join the Episcopal Church, even though the Canadian Church went down there and said, please join us. We don't have any members. You would be honored VIPs in the Anglican Canadian Church.
Well, they're wheels within wheels within wheels.
Right.
2003, under Frank Griswold, the Episcopal Church invited Cuba to rejoin,
Mm-hmm.
and Cuba at that time said no. 2009, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church said, Cuba, we will start funding your clergy pensions again.
Wow,
Now,
that's different.
one of the things that Cuban clergy who were contributing to the church pension fund before the revolution, and if they're still alive, they've not been able to draw a dime because the U.S. government policy until recently forbade transfer of funds to Cuba. And Cuban clergy working in Cuba, the Canadian church was asked, well, can you help us set up funds and pension funds? And Canada said, well, no, gosh, we don't have any money, so stick with us, but we won't help you financially. So in February of this year, the Cuban General Synod met, and Fred Hiltz, the Archbishop of Canada, went down. And there was a resolution put forward before the Cuban Synod that said, let's study how we want to go forward. Since 1965, we've been under a Metropolitan Church Council led by the Anglican Church of Canada Archbishop, plus the Archbishop of the West Indies and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. But for all intents and purposes, we've been under the jurisdiction of Canada. Mm-hmm. And let's study that and see who we may want to affiliate with. Well, a substitute resolution was put forward saying, let's join the Episcopal Church of the USA. And Fred Hiltz argued against that, saying, no, don't do that. It's premature. The Anglican way is to form a committee and to study something. Well, the Cuban Synod voted against its bishop, against Fred Hiltz, to join the Episcopal Church of the USA. Now, what's going on here?
Well, I know what's going on here, George. Commies loving commies.
Yeah, well, but see, the thing is, the commies wanted to stay with Canada. Now, it's easy to throw around commies.
Yes,
but
it is.
In 2007, Cuba had a bishop, and when he retired, they could not elect a new bishop. The synod kept deadlocking and deadlocking and deadlocking. And the reason why it was deadlocking was between personal animosities and also between that faction that wanted to back the revolution, be full members of Cuban society and support Fidel and be faithful to the government. And then there was that group that just wanted to stay as far away from the communists as possible. We saw that in 2007, to overcome this, they decided to elect two suffragan bishops, mm-hmm. one for East Cuba, one for West Cuba. And they elected someone who was sort of aligned with the conservative, mm-hmm. apolitical bloc, because if you were anti-communist, you'd wind up in prison. So it was between being apolitical And the other person elected was the first woman bishop in Cuba, Nerva Aguilera.
Well, you say
And
elected, and I need to change that definition of elected. Was not there a contest rather than an
no,
election?
you're jumping ahead. You're
I'm
jumping ahead.
sorry, it's the cold.
Nervicot Aguilera
Yeah.
was elected as a suffragan bishop, where basically the two sides each got to choose who they wanted.
Yeah.
Now, what's the big deal? Is it because she's the first woman bishop of Cuba? No. She was a long term leader of the CDR,
That's right.
the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And those are the local bloc, Communist Party bloc cell groups who keep tabs over who basically fight counter revolutionary activity in their neighborhoods. Here's an Episcopal priest who's also leader of the CDR. That's one bishop. Um, well, 2012 rolls around, and they finally decide they're not going to have any more elections, but they're going to have a new bishop, and they're going to hold an essay contest. And Catherine Jefferts Schori is going to be the judge of the essay contest. And the winner of the essay contest to be Bishop of Cuba was Griselda Delgado, who was a Bolivian who happened to move to Cuba. Her husband's a Cuba. And so she's a woman priest. And so she's perfectly in tune with Catherine Jefferts Schori. And Cuban church right now is like the Russian Orthodox Church was in 1991. Mm-hmm. Some of its leaders, I would doubt very much whether they're Christians at all. Others are saints of God who have overcome persecution to be faithful to the light of Jesus Christ in terrible circumstances. The evangelical churches, the unofficial, unorganized churches in Cuba, have been growing by leaps and bounds over the past 50 years during times of persecution. No new churches have been built in Cuba since the 1960s. It's against the law to build a new church. You can't meet in people's homes because that's counter-revolutionary activity. So Christians have to meet in secret or meet in government-supervised churches. So you've got an Episcopal church that has a weak top layer, but over it is a group of people who have been faithful unto death. And it's easy for me to joke and say, oh, that woman won by an essay contest, or this woman was a Communist Party official who was also a bishop. You know, that opens up jokes about Catherine Jefferts Schori, but the point is, this is a church in transition that we really need to pray for.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, the whole point of this is if we're going to have open relationships, and the Americans now have the ability to have some financial influence, political influence, and hopefully spiritual influence on the Episcopal Church in Cuba, now's your chance. Pastors,
you know what is not a problem, Kevin, in Cuba?
Yeah.
It's not a gay marriage. That's not an issue that's dividing the Cuban church. Do you know why?
I don't know why.
Homosexuality under Fidel Castro is a criminal offense. It's a criminal offense in the communist Cuba, homosexual relations. So I don't know
not
if
an issue, huh?
it's not an issue. And maybe in the General Convention, if Cuba does come, this is another vote for our side, the conservatives. I don't know. Maybe it's not such a bad idea.
We now have 3 conservative dioceses. All right, so that's the story with Cuba. Keep them in your prayers. It's obvious transition. Yes, there's lots of similarities between the Communist and the Episcopal Church in George and I's eyes. But I can't let this episode go without talking about fundraising, no matter how sick I am. Yes?
No.
Am I jumping ahead?
Yes, you're jumping ahead because the Reformed Episcopal Church,
yes, is in Cuba.
ACNA, is in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's very small. It's smaller than the Episcopal Church, but it has not fallen. Maybe it's escaped the radar because it doesn't have a nice, lovely cathedral in downtown Havana the way the Episcopal Church does. Mm-hmm. A Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in downtown Havana. But the Reformed Episcopal Church is working in that country through their Canadian branch. And I don't like to use this word, but it does not have the reputation of being compromised.
Right. Well, I think that's
that God is moving in Cuba in a remarkable way. And sometimes we just have to put aside our prejudices, in my part, and just allow God to work in ways that I may not want to see happen or understand.
On to fundraising. You have to excuse
the important stuff.
You have to excuse my brain. It's on cold medicine, cough medicine, Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I wrote here at hashtag Surf Cuba. It's the new thing in talking politics. We need to raise money for George to go to Salt Lake City. He's going to cover General Convention. He will be one of the good reporters there. We've raised $500 of the 1,000 or the 1,500 I wanted to raise. So if you could go to anglican.tv/donate and click on the donate button, we can send George via airplane. He can stay in a real hotel, not in a campsite, and be a reporter for Anglican Ink and Anglican TV.
Kevin, you're going to have to push. I started looking at the hotel
Uh
prices.
oh.
Oh, Mr. Hilton, you're making a mint of money off the
Yes.
Episcopal Church. I mean, I look at the cost outside of the time of General Convention, and hey, I might as well move to Salt
Yeah, I
Lake
know
City.
it's
It's so
cheap.
cheap. No, you would think this is in Manhattan in November or something.
All right. Well,
So it's maybe a little bit more.
let's shoot for 2,000. So we got 500. We got how many months? 2 months to raise this to get some cheap
Less
airfare.
than 100 days, 99
Yeah,
days.
99 days. So please go to anglican.tv/donate. You could send a check to Anglican TV. Everything is a 501(c). All your money is tax deductible if you don't make too much money. I know some of our viewers make too much money to write off a donation, but that's not my problem. And that would be on the website as well. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and you've been listening to episode
170.
170 of Anglican